Welcome to Down to Earth Astrology and Primal Girl Wellness. This is Miss Jenny. I am your astrologer. So in this video, we're examining the chart of a murderer and his known victims. We are lucky in that we have not just the case information, but also the birth dates for the people involved, except for one person who was born in Argentina. We do not have access to her birth information. So we are able to examine the charts against each other, as well as take a closer look at the murderer himself. This is an excellent opportunity to learn more about these violent planets in an astrology chart and how they might actually look in real life. Let's begin. 4 charts, 3 victims, 1 murderer. So as we go through these slides, this is going to be an exercise for you to play along with, which will help you learn your astrology a little bit better and make this more entertaining as it's interactive. So the first chart that we have, the only hard aspect I can find is a Jupiter-Neptune square. And even then, it's a wide square. So I personally wouldn't use it because it's not close enough for me. Because the closer something is, more dynamic and present the aspect is. So wide aspects get a little slobby and loose and more diffuse in their presence. Not a fan. Now, we might possibly have a Moon-Pluto conjunction. We're not sure because we don't have a time of birth for any of these charts, which means depending on what time of the day the person was born, that moon is closer to or further away from Neptune or Pluto, sorry. So this remains a question. I wouldn't use it because it's as is set up for noon. This is too far apart to be significant as far as I'm concerned. The only tight aspect that we have is Pluto opposing Chiron. That's it. That's the only hard aspect in this chart. Now, I just want to point out that Chiron is an asteroid or a planetoid. I'm not sure what they're labeling it these days. But it's a recent modern discovery, and it's still considered a minor player, so you can use it if you want. I personally don't attribute too much significance to it because of its status. And ultimately, in terms of murder, well, murder most foul, I want to see stronger connections and more something more dynamic, more hard, more. I want to see a lot more than just a Pluto Chiron opposition. I'm just saying. Like maybe we could use that Moon Pluto conjunction, but again, we don't know what time you're born, so that moon may not be anywhere near Pluto if they were born at a certain time of day. Anyway, next chart. So over here we have a T-square. It involves the moon, Mercury, and Neptune. And again, the moon is going to move back and forth, but it's still pretty close. We're going to use it. So the moon is opposing Neptune or Mercury. The moon is opposing Mercury here, and the leg of that T-square is Neptune. And it's tight and it's active, so there is that. Now this particular chart also carries a Saturn-Pluto conjunction right there. A Saturn-Pluto conjunction is not really making any hard aspects to anything else, but they're making a hard aspect to each other, so that'll count. Oh, sorry. Now the next chart is going to be another T-square. We got a lot of T-squares over here with Moon, Mercury, Jupiter, and Pluto. So Jupiter and Pluto is here, Mercury is here, and the moon is here. So there's our T-square with those planets. At the same time, this particular chart is interesting because it has 2 T-squares. 2, my friends. So the other T-square is the sun. Go away. The sun of the moon, because this is a full moon chart. And the leg then becomes Mars. In fact, let me write in full moon in bigger letters. Now this is an interesting chart because it's a very dynamic chart. So we not only have the full moon, right? We've got double T-squares happening. So because we've got the T-square out here, I've got the T-square out here, which basically it's almost a grand cross. The problem is these planets are just out of orb enough that they don't make the tight grand cross configuration. So it's basically a double T-square under a full moon. Woohoo! And the final chart we have is again another T-square. So in this particular case, we have Pluto with the sun and the moon. And again, this is another full moon chart. So we've got a full moon chart with another T-square. So throw that in to throw you off. So with that said, out of these four charts, just looking at this alone, personally, my first guess would be either this full moon chart or this full moon chart as potential murderer because these are high tension charts. They're under a lot of evolutionary developmental tension, and they're both full moon charts, which really kind of makes people more prone to emotional outbursts and irrational responses when they do have them. My secondary choices would probably be this one, and maybe even not so much. Between these two, I personally would not think too much of them because they're fairly easy charts. But that's just me, and that's just at first look. So you tell me what you think. Now, before we go any further, let's talk about what's considered a violent star. Oh, and before I forget, let me just explain what we're looking at here. So this is a statue of Uranus, or the god Uranus, who is believed to have eaten his children to retain his grip on power. So interestingly, children always represent the future. And if you're willing to devour your children to maintain your current position, or basically hang on to the present and the past, there's a real resistance and refusal to move forward and to let the future happen. Um, and I thought this was funny because Uranus is very much a forward-thinking planet. So it goes against the whole uh, mythology that we have about Uranus as a planet and how it's employed. Now, understand also too, and here, that's Uranus, or I'm sorry, Aquarius, which Uranus rules, is ruled by Saturn and Uranus. And Saturn represents the past, Uranus represents the future. The god Uranus, right, was really fighting off the future because that meant giving up his power. So I thought that was interesting. I don't know, just stream of thought there. All right, this crazy looking guy down here, this is a statue of Mars. And this is a statue of Pluto abducting Proserpina, which is the Roman name for Persephone. So Pluto abducting Persephone. So there's your statues from mythology and your thing. So here's the thing: when we learn astrology, and even now, like you'll hear there's a lot of parroting and things that are repeated over and over and over again without any real examination. And we shouldn't get upset with astrologers or astrology for doing this. This is just what people do. In astrology, a lot of information is literally simplified to its simplest form. So simple a 6-year-old could remember this stuff. So with that said, there's a lot lost in translation, and certainly a lot that's not given to us in interpretation. Now, the problem with this is when we do that, we tend to oversimplify things and turn everything into a big bag of keywords, which is why you'll find people who picked up an astrology book 2 weeks ago or have just studied for 6 months under their master or their sensei or whatever they're calling it this time, right? Because there is a girl, in fact, who was literally doing YouTube broadcasts as an astrologer and talking about her teacher having just finished teaching her the week before this thing, whatever, whatever. Wow, okay. Anyway. So things tend to get simplified, and then just because it's a big bag of keywords that people string together and make sentences with. So, and I'm going to give you an example, and I'm sure you've heard this. So the planet Mars is determined to rule, come back here, right? Anger, physical violence, and sex, okay? Uranus, sudden eruptions, berserkers, and deviants, people who go against the norm, who are nonconformists in some unusual way. Pluto, rage, slow eruptions, right? So the difference is where Uranus is like a thunderclap and a lightning strike, or an earthquake, right? Pluto is a volcano, that slowly erupts and destroys everything in its path. Pluto also rules death, sex, and of course perversion or perverts, and not the fun kind. So when we look at this, it's easy to assume that, Mars, Uranus, and Pluto strong or angular in a chart is going to show us people who have a predisposition or are more likely to be the expression of these things, angry, violent, over or hypersexual, explosive temper, out of control, murderers, perverts, deviants. It's easy to assume that these string of keywords are going to show up wherever these planets are placed. And if someone has these planets prominent in their chart, then we should expect to see these literal keywords. However, that is not the case. The thing I need you guys to really understand and remember is that when it comes to things like violence or murder, right? These two particular things there's literally every person on the planet is capable of doing these things. I mean, it may take some people more than others. Some people don't take very much, can do anything. Um, but every person is capable of doing this, which means that there are a number of planetary combinations that could show up that would lend themselves to these acts, right? The difference is when we look at a chart, we're not actually likely to get indications whether someone's going to be hypersexual or hyper aggressive or hyper assaultive or anything like that. What we will see is how those things are expressed and how those things play into their evolutionary development. And we're going to talk about that in a second. So when you hear people read off these keywords when they see planets or aspects of these planets in someone's chart, just nod your head and keep on rolling, because it's literally the kindergarten version of an explanation for a calculus problem. So there's grains of truth in it, but it is not a perfect picture or a meaningful one. But let's start here and let's use those keywords and as we look at a chart, right? So the first thing we're looking at, because remember, we've got 4 charts, 3 victims, and 1 murderer. In this group, one of these charts belongs to a murderer. So if we use the keywords and we're looking for Mars, for violence, as an example, right? So in this particular chart, we've got Mars over here, setting up a T-square to the sun and possibly the moon, depending on what time you were born, right? So remember, we don't have time of birth. So we know right off and it's a full moon chart. So we know right off the bat, this is somebody who's born under a full moon. So they're much more capable of reacting irrationally or overwhelmingly emotionally to something than other people, given the right circumstances and triggers. And all of this typically going to come through their Mars, right? So, and if Mars rules sex and aggression and physical violence, this is somebody we would assume, based on this chart, is definitely capable of irrational violence. So what are the other 2 planets we look for murderers and violent people and, sociopaths, right? Criminals. Well, we look for Uranus and we look for Pluto. Well, if we look at Pluto right here, right? Pluto sets up another T-square. Now, and again, depending on where the moon is, right? So this moon is going to give us a T-square with the sun or Mercury. If this is the T-square with Pluto, Mercury, and the moon, Pluto rules death and rage and slow eruptions, right? And deviance, perversion. And the moon's in Scorpio. Ho, ho, ho. So with the moon opposing Mercury and involving Pluto, we might, just looking at the keywords, say, okay, so perversion and slow burning rage, or slow eruptions, rage and slow eruptions, perversions, moon's in Scorpio they tell us that it's over sex and always thinking about sex. With Mercury, which is your mind and communication, so we would think this might be someone who thinks about like kinky S&M, leather bondage whips, hurting people, sadistic sex, right? I mean, if we're just running keywords together, that's the picture we're getting. So looking at this chart, and remember, it's a full moon, this could definitely be the murderer. I mean, this has got all the seasonings to make that recipe, right? But what about this one? So again, we're going to start with Mars, right? So does Mars, is Mars prominent? Is it doing anything? Okay, so Mars is not really making any hard aspects. Mars is just kind of hanging out. And the aspects it does make are friendly aspects, so we're not really having a lot of issues here. However, Mars is there in that steamy, sexy, or hypersexual Scorpio. So could this be somebody who's capable of murder? Well, if you listen to the list of keywords they assigned to Scorpio and Mars, absolutely, because this is somebody who would definitely hurt you in ways other people won't if given the chance. At least that's what they tell us, right? Now, what are the other planets? Uranus and Pluto. So Uranus in this chart, um, eh, Uranus in chart is not really doing a whole lot. I mean, we could theoretically make it a square to that Jupiter, but it's pretty wide, so I wouldn't use them. So we'll skip Uranus. But what about Pluto? Well, look at this. Pluto's right here, and Pluto sets up a T-square. Again, another full moon chart, right? So Pluto sets up a T-square to that full moon. So again, the keywords for Pluto are death, sex, revenge, slow eruptions, deviance, perversion, all that hinky, scary stuff, right? And it's involved with the sun and the moon, which is the very identity and core of who you are. Well, could this be somebody who's capable of murder? Well, if we go with the keywords, absolutely, this is somebody who's capable of keywords or capable of murder. Now, I know some of you are looking at this and you're seeing that the sun is at 29. What's this? 29 Sag, where the moon is at 5 Cancer. So ideally, we'd like that sun to be at 0 to 5 Capricorn to make the opposition, but it is still there. So this is what they call an out of sign opposition because there are only, and again, this depends on what time they were born, because that moon's going to move back and forth depending on how the chart adjusts with time of birth. So even if this were true and this person were actually born at noon, that means that there's only 6 degrees between the sun and the moon, which we will absolutely take. So we have an orb of 10 degrees on a full moon. So that is what's called an out of sign opposition. And this is who we think might be our murderer. Out of all of our choices, we've got a couple more to go, right? These full moon babies, man, you got to watch them. And then, of course, there's this guy. So starting with Mars, is Mars making any hard aspects? Well, no, actually. Mars is making actually really good supportive aspects. So Mars is not falling into this equation for violence. And what about Uranus? Well, we do have Uranus and the Sun together. So this is going to give somebody, give us a person who's a little bit more high strung, certainly explosive, right? And potentially capable of being a berserker, as it were. But other than that conjunction, Uranus also is not really making any hard aspects. So what's the next one we got? Pluto. Well, Pluto is here, and Pluto may or may not be with the moon, again, depending on what time the person was born, because that moon is going to move around. What we do know for sure is that it is opposing Chiron. So Pluto-Chiron oppositions, maybe. I mean, they're pretty impersonal. Pluto's a transpersonal planet. It's an outer planet. Chiron is kind of like an in-betweener, like it's kind of a transpersonal planet. It's not one of the core planets. So I probably wouldn't even really use that. I mean, we could, but I'm not seeing it. Other than these, what I've just shown you, there's nothing else going on in this chart. And now we come to the last chart. Now in this chart, we have a T, again, back to the T-squares, right? And another full moon chart. We've got the full moon there, and the T-square is set up with Neptune. Now again, depending on what time the person was born, that moon will move back and forth a little bit, but it's still going to be with an orb of that moon to make it a full moon, and certainly with an orb of this Neptune. So with a full moon making a T-square to Neptune, with the Neptune keywords, there's always the suggestion of drugs, delusion, fantasy, escapism, like pick all the negative descriptions they have for Neptune, as Neptune is such a villain for some astrologers. So could this be somebody who's capable of murder? Well, maybe, if they're in a very delusional state, and if you're killing people you don't even know, you're probably delusional. So this is definitely a candidate to be a murderer as well. So, but we really want to see Mars, right? Mars, Uranus, and Pluto. So let's take a look at Mars. Well, Mars right here is conjunct Venus, but it's not actually making any hard aspects. So that's not going to work. Uranus is over here with Jupiter. And again, that's not really making any hard aspects. In fact, yeah, neither of these, Mars or Uranus, are making, they're actually making really nice aspects. So that leaves us with Pluto. Well, what is Pluto doing? Well, Pluto is here, and Pluto is in what they call an out of sign conjunction with Saturn. It's a little wider than I like, but we can probably still use it. So we've got Saturn and Pluto together, and that might do it. Now, the thing with Saturn and Pluto is depending on how it's configured in a chart, Saturn and Pluto can lend itself to cruelty, excessive cruelty. It's not a great combination to have. Now, this particular conjunction is out of sign, so that helps ameliorate some of that hard or harshness that comes with Saturn and Pluto. And also, you typically want to see something else in this chart to support the possibility of any cruelty being expressed by the person from this aspect. So I'm a little iffy on that, but it's certainly there. So could this person be the murderer? Absolutely. This could be somebody who's delusional and having all sorts of paranoid fantasies, that's going on a killing spree because, some measure of cruel expression, blah, 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 blah. Maybe. I don't know. Let's see. So the question I have for you is based on the astrology knowledge that you have, right? Which chart, 1, 2, 3, or 4, do you think is the murderer? And right here is a good time to pause the video so that you can go back and review these charts and maybe even do a little search on the internet for keywords from Mars, Uranus, Pluto, or things that they describe as being violent aspects in a chart. Like take your time and really go through and examine what you're reading and what you've been told to the charts to try and take a guess here about who's who. It's okay. I'll be here when you come back. Surprise! Chart number 1 is a chart of one of the victims. This is Carol's son, and she is the mother of 2 of the victims in the Yosemite Park murders. The other 2 girls, one was her daughter, Julie, and the other girl is the one we don't have birth information for, and her name is Silvina Peloso. I don't know where birth information is, can't find it on Google. In any event, this is Carol's chart. Now remember, by the rules and keywords they give us for violence and rage and murder and all this sort of stuff, Carol fits, and she checks all the boxes, right? So we've got a full moon, here, let me use a better thing. We've got a full moon baby, which is given to, high emotions. Oh, come on. Right? And the T-square is that unpredictable, explosive Mars in Aquarius. And she's got a second T-square in her chart, right? Depending on where that moon is, right? Involving no less than Pluto itself, okay? And then, of course, there's that little Uranus-Neptune square, which is not helping things any. So where is the violence that we're seeing in Carol's chart? Well, I mean, it's possible that the violence is part of her evolutionary process, but instead of her putting it out into the world, she's absorbing that energy into herself. I mean, we don't know. What we do know is that based on the traditional rules that were given by, these watered down, simplistic definitions of planets and things, that it clearly doesn't apply here because Carol was found burned to death in the trunk of her car with Silvina. And here, my friends, is the chart of Julie Sund, Carol's daughter. Now, again, same thing. If we go by the rules that we're given, okay, we've got a full moon chart. I don't like that. Got a full moon chart, and that T-square in this case was Neptune, right? So it gives us a fanciful or escapist, potentially delusional nature. And then, of course, we've got this Saturn-Pluto conjunction, which could lend itself to some, what is the word I'm looking for? Cruelty. Now, theoretically, this is a wide square with that Venus-Mars. So Venus-Mars conjunct squaring Pluto, it's kind of wide, but you might be able to use it. And that also will lend itself to a certain amount of cruelty, right? But is this who she was? No. In fact, Julie Sund, while Carol and Silvina were found burned to death, locked in the trunk of Carol's car, Julie was found elsewhere, and the only reason they found Julie's body is because the murderer left a note that said, "Ha ha, had fun with this one," and literally gave the law enforcement a map of where to find her. Now, as we get into the charts and the connections, you're going to see some interesting things pop up about why she may have been separated from the other two. Um, but yeah, so if you pick chart number 4, nope, she is the victim, not the murderer here. And this is chart number 2. This is Joey Armstrong. This was a murder that was committed a few years later. And Joey Armstrong, the murderer actually nearly decapitated her when he murdered her. Ooh, right? Gruesome, gruesome murder. And again, another full moon chart, right? It's out of sign, but it's there. You full moon babies, man, you really knock it out of the park when you do things in big dramatic ways. Now, with her, we definitely have that Pluto involvement, right? So it's perfect. It would make perfect sense that a full moon with a T-square to Pluto could be capable of murder and violence. But in fact, she didn't do it. And also to remember that Mars is in Scorpio. Okay. She didn't do it. In fact, she was the victim of it, right? So far, we're batting 0 for 0 in terms of these old simplified kindergarten interpretations of planets and aspects when it comes to sex, death, rape, and murder. And here, my friends, is the part that will blow your mind. This is the chart of the murderer. This is Cary Stayner, who I really recommend you look him up on Wikipedia and then go do some research if you really like serial killer stories and biographies. Oof, what a life story. And again, same thing. Well, not the same thing, but we talked about this before. The only thing we can find is that Pluto opposing Chiron. There's no other hard aspects in his chart, so it doesn't make any sense. Where is the violence? Where's the rage? Where's the deviance, perversion? Where's the murderous impulses in the chart based on the planets? Like they keep telling us. Well, I suppose we might be able to use that Sun-Uranus conjunction, but that's not really enough. And the fact of the matter is, the chart isn't necessarily going to show us murderous impulses because, believe it or not, as you can see from his chart, with like very little going on in terms of, classic murderous rage type impulses in his nature. One of the things that we know is that everyone and anyone is capable of doing these things, right? Because this is a question of mental health, not astrological destiny. And I think that's the part I want you guys to really, really appreciate. There are things that we do that are a matter of character, not predetermination. The stars do not compel you to do some things. The stars literally compel you to have some types of evolutionary experiences and to go through some things. But ultimately, your character is what will decide which path you're taking, which turn you're making, and how you're going to deal with the circumstances that life has presented you. Okay, and no matter how beautiful your chart is, you can have the easiest chart in the world, you can still end up being, a horrible person committing crimes against humanity. And I cannot find his chart. I'll put it in another video. There's a gentleman, I'll give you an example, who sexually assaulted a girl who was she was coming out of a party at a college, stumbled, passed out behind a dumpster. He sexually assaulted her behind the dumpster. He's horrible, horrible. And 2 other college boys happened to walk upon the scene, see what was going on, like broke it up, ran him off, called the police. If you look at the rapist chart, it's a beautiful chart. There are no hard aspects. If anything, he actually has a grand trident of fire. He's got a great chart, and he was in fact born with a silver spoon in his mouth and every advantage to his disposal, and got off light for the rape, which was we had witnesses for this, right? And try to get off with I'm too pretty and too soft defense. Don't send me to prison. So the thing about it is the chart will give you lots of information about a lot of things, but when it comes to a person's morality, a person's integrity, a person's character, the choices they will make when confronted with A or B, right? And how they're going to respond to stressors in their life. Like Mr. Stayner was under some amazing life stressors, which led him in this direction and got him all broken and twisted inside. That's something a chart's not going to show you. And you guys really want to keep that in mind when you're looking at other people's charts. And also when other people are giving you the business about your chart. So if they're starting this nonsense, rape, murder, and oh, so violent, just walk away. Just walk away. don't know what they're talking about. All right, so this is the other thing that's very, very important that I want to share with you guys, because this is what connects to the current case we're looking at in Idaho with the Idaho 4 and this Brian Koberger. And I have said when I was looking at his charts, there are no connections between his natal chart and any of the victims. There are no connections. It makes no sense. Because when someone comes into your life and they're going to impact your life, there will be connections between the charts. Now, not everyone you meet and have a relationship with, even superficially, is going to change your life. At least, well, not in a dramatic way. But the more compelled you are to know somebody, or the more resonance there is that you two need to connect in a meaningful way. So it's either having a friendship or a relationship or something like that, like they save your life or they take your life. There's some meaningful connection between the two of you. You're going to find connections between the charts. It has to happen, because otherwise, people that you don't have any connections with, you're not going to feel one way or the other for. People that you have not great connections with, you're actually going to feel an aversion to. It's those people you just, I don't know, I just don't like that person. And a lot of times it's not even that there's necessarily anything wrong with the person, it's just there's really dissonant connections, or not friendly connections between the charts that you're vibing off of, right? Because how could you have an opinion about someone you don't even know? So here, keep in mind, and this is the most important dramatic thing I can show you when it comes to murders and victims, right? Cary Stayner did not know any of his victims. He picked them randomly, like just on a whim, did not know them from Adam, and they did not know him until the moment they met him, and then of course he murdered them. So, would two complete strangers have connections between their chart if the only purpose this person served was to take their life from them, right? Because that's a pretty meaningful change or impact on your life if somebody's taking your life. Well, here's what we got. So with Cary and Carol, use my red pen here. Right, with Cary and Carol, we're going to start with his Jupiter and Saturn, which is right here, okay? And it connects to her Uranus. Give me a second, let me catch up. There we go, right? So right here, his Jupiter and Saturn opposes her Uranus. That's a direct hit. There's a direct connection there, okay? His Sun, which is right here, involves her Pluto, which is right here. So his Sun Jupiter, or his Sun, I'm sorry, his Sun, sorry about that. So his Sun, which is right here, connects with her Jupiter Pluto, right? Almost exactly. His Neptune, where is it? Right here, is connecting to her Sun Mars. So her Sun is here, okay? And her Mars is here, okay? And finally, between these two, his Jupiter Saturn, go back to Jupiter Saturn now, is also connecting to her Neptune, almost exact, right? So we're seeing all kinds of direct connections between these charts, right? These two people don't know each other from Adam. The only contact they had was moments before he took her life. All right, so if this rule is true, it should hold true for pretty much all of his victims, right? Well, let's take a look. And again, we don't have Sylvina's, unfortunately. So with Julie, who's the daughter, now I don't know, but my suspicion is that he raped the daughter. And I went back and checked the stories and records on the internet, and it sounds like that's exactly what he did, along with some other things. And we'll talk about why I say that in a second. So again, his Jupiter Saturn is connecting with Julie's Pluto. Now Julie is the next, she's out here. So Julie's Pluto is there, okay? And it's a square. Yeah, so they've got his Jupiter Saturn squares her Pluto. These are all hard aspects, by the way. His Pluto, which is here, is connecting her Jupiter-Uranus, which is going to be over here. Okay, and his Uranus sun, remember he's got that Uranus sun we thought might make him a little nuts, right? A little hinky crazy, is connecting to her Venus Mars, and her Venus Mars is here. So that's a conjunction. And the reason I say I suspected it might be the possibility that there was that he had raped Julie, or maybe Julie had originally been the intended target of a rape, and the other two just happened to be in the way, or collateral damage, as it were, is because with his Sun Uranus and that Venus Mars, a physical animal attraction, a compulsive sexual attraction would definitely be present when these two came near each other. All right, and then there's Cary and Joy. And Joy is the murder that occurred many years later. And this is the woman he almost decapitated. Oof, I know, right? So again, his Jupiter and Saturn is very active here. His Jupiter and Saturn is connected to her Uranus. She is the last chart out. Okay. His Pluto is connecting to her Mercury and Neptune, which is going to be over here, almost exact. His Sun will be not conjuncting. His Sun will be connecting to her Mars, right? And that moon, depending on what time of day he was born, give or take, may or may not be in a tight aspect to her Saturn, which is over here, right? So there's all these very tight aspects across the charts connecting them, and multiple ones at that. And this is exactly how this played out in real life. This is somebody who had a significant impact on the lives of these four women, the three that we have the charts for, because he ended their life. That's pretty significant. So what I'm saying, and this is why I'm a little suspicious about the Brian Koberger case with the Idaho 4, if Brian had in fact ended the lives of these four students, because we can see in their charts between friends, like they've got connections with each other, even with the two roommates that survived, there's connections between all of those charts all over the place. But when you plug Brian's chart into their charts, there's no connections. There's nothing there, right? So how is it possible that he is the person instrumental in death? I'm not saying he is or isn't innocent. He could be innocent, he could be guilty. I'm just saying that astrologically speaking, when someone has a significant impact on your life, there should be strong, tight, clear, multiple connections between your chart and theirs. We're seeing it here with complete strangers, with Cary Stayner and literally, well, three complete strangers that did not meet him until the moment he murdered them. We're seeing these bang, 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 like a light show lighting up the charts, where there's all these connections across his chart to theirs, right? In the Brian Koberger case, we've got nothing. So that's why that was a little suspicious to me. But this is what we're looking for. So when you're looking at the chart of murderers, these are some of the things, that we're looking at. So while we got this here, let's take a look at Mr. Stayner's chart a little more closely. Okay, so for those of you who haven't had a chance to look this guy up, the short version of his life story is this. Cary Stayner's brother had been abducted and was gone for like 7 years or something, and was abducted when he was 7 and didn't come back until he was like 15, and had been living with a man who had basically kidnapped and molested him all those years. And when his brother did come back, made huge headlines, big deal. So you can imagine that Cary, as part of this family, when his brother was abducted, like that was traumatizing, and everyone, I'm sure, was going through all manner of grief and shock for years. Like, because that's not something, it's not as simple as losing a child because of an accident or illness, which is bad enough. But to have your child abducted, snatched off the street and never knowing where they are, because there's always the possibility that they could be alive, and there's always the thought that you should have done something differently. Would have weighed very heavy on his parents, and I'm sure it would have made parenting extremely difficult. So here would have been a child, and as any member of the family would be dealing with, who's not only dealing with the personal loss of a sibling and the terror that could happen to them, but also parents who are emotionally checked out, like they just don't have it to give to this child to nurture them the way they need to, because they are also grieving and going through profound psychological distress and trauma. for years. Now, apparently, as if this wasn't bad enough, apparently, while this is going on, Cary, who was in the home, and they're all dealing with this, was simultaneously during this time being molested by an uncle. Yes, yes. While all of this was happening, he was also being molested by an uncle for years. So you can imagine what a profound and distressing twist and bend that must have made in his psyche in not good ways. Because I have to go read his story further, but if he had even attempted to talk to his parents, if you've ever known people who've been molested as kids, unfortunately, far too frequently, there are parents who literally would dismiss them and call them liars and totally invalidate and refuse to believe that this is happening, which makes the child even more vulnerable, and traumatized. So it is entirely possible that Cary Stayner's parents either were so deep in their grief and distress that they were unable to be there for him if he had attempted to say something, or if they even had the presence of mind to notice that something was really wrong with Cary and not just he's grieving the loss of his brother. But it's also possible that it would have been too much, and they may have been one of those kinds of parents who are like, no, 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 how can, Uncle Joe would never do something like that. How can you lie? Stop saying those things. Because unfortunately, these things happen. People don't know how to respond to these things. They refuse to believe it, so they'll blame the kid. They'll blame the kid. Horrible, horrible thing. Anyway, so that is Cary's start in life. Fun, huh? So we can imagine what just a box of scary black spiders the inside of his head was. Now, um, I'm not completely sure what the psychodynamics were, the social dynamics were between him, his brother, the public, and all sorts of stuff. But these things weigh heavy because that was definitely an unusual and extraordinary situation that family found itself in. So when we look at his chart, we have to look at this in terms of evolution. When you look at anybody's chart, you have to look at this in terms of evolution, because it's the only way. He had a very specific path he was passing through in this lifetime. Remember, his Jupiter and Saturn His Jupiter and Saturn makes contacts with all three of the victim charts that we have, like direct, exact, hard hits, hard aspects to the charts of all of those people. And Jupiter and Saturn has everything to do with karma, right? Jupiter and Saturn, if you look at these two symbols, look at that very closely, they're literally two sides of the same coin. It's one symbol flipped upside down to the other. So Jupiter and Saturn represent two very distinct sides to the same coin, and had a lot of it has to do with social evolution, karma, and debts we pay to society. So in this particular situation with that Jupiter-Saturn conjunction connecting all those charts, there was some very heavy, there are some very heavy karmic things that were being worked out through this situation and this encounter between these people. I'm not saying that it should have been murder. I'm not saying it should not have been murder. I'm just saying there were heavy, serious, big picture stuff being played out in the grand scheme of things that we're not necessarily going to be privy to. Unfortunately, that he was karmically locked into playing out one way or the other. So there's that, right? Now, the first thing we're going to do, we're not going to look at the sun. We're actually going to look at the moon. So we're looking at his moon, and he's got the moon trapped between two malefics. Let me get my highlighter. So Mars is a malefic, Pluto is a malefic. These are both really hard, aggressive, heavy, oh, so heavy, and unkind planets. The moon is soft and tender and vulnerable and doesn't have any defenses. So the moon, trapped between Mars and Pluto, gives us a psyche that is very raw and very open and vulnerable to, unfortunately, the projections, Pluto, and the violence, Mars, of other people. Hence, we know that he was being molested by an uncle, and probably a whole lot of other horrible things were going on inside that family as well. Now, with this particular combination, Moon, Mars, and Pluto together in Virgo, it's going to give us somebody who's by nature more sensitive, more refined, and seemingly more neurotic, right? They're very easily upset. And I don't mean upset like a child having a tantrum. I mean more easily disturbed, like disturbing the water, right? Water picks up vibrations from everywhere, so the slightest movement will cause the water to respond and ripple, right? So it's that kind of thing. It's got a very finely tuned radar. and he's very, very sensitive to things going on. They affect him more deeply and more wholly than they would other people. He's not thick-skinned, is what I'm trying to say, I suppose. So right there, this is an issue. This is definitely an issue. And remember that Pluto is here opposing that Chiron, right? So the moon may or may not be close to Pluto, depending on what time he was born. But the moon is certainly carrying this energy, right, up into that Mars. So there's a lot of stuff happening here that's not easy. It's not easy. A lot of big open wounds, and I imagine that he was sexually traumatized at a much earlier age than he's telling anybody in his biographies. Okay, so there's that, right? So right here, we got somebody who's very thin-skinned, who's very vulnerable, and who is basically a giant projection screen and a receiver for people's violence, emotional, physical, psychological, as well as their projections of their own inner crap, Pluto. So now, and we've talked about this Jupiter, Saturn in Capricorn, right? So now we're going to look at this. Now we're going to go to the sun. So with the sun and Mercury and Uranus together, because remember, he's got it very close here, right? With the sun, Mercury, and Uranus very close together like this, one, it's going to give you somebody who's usually very, very bright, but also there may be a disorganization of thoughts. So he may have had problems processing or organizing his thoughts better. In this particular case, with all that and the North Node in Leo, and that Moon Mars Pluto thing going on, I would expect that he was actually a little hyperactive, or a little ADHD, which, you know, if he's also been traumatized or enduring trauma at the same time, would make all kinds of sense. So I'm not the least bit surprised about that. But you know, it would have been a problem, certainly growing up, because people didn't understand what that was. So on top of him enduring trauma and processing the grief of his brother, yada yada yada, and going through trauma, being molested while this is going on, this inability to regulate your thinking and your energy and your responses to things would not be unexpected. Would not be unexpected. Also, too, with all of this being placed in Leo, right? So here, I want you guys to hold on to this for a second, right? And also the North Node is there. So there's an evolutionary life lesson that he was supposed to have been learning or working through in this lifetime. With Leo, all right, and starting with his planets in Leo, his whole trip in this life, believe it or not, was to receive love, to learn how to receive love and give love to other people. It's literally all about coming from the heart. With Leo and Aquarius, the Leo Aquarius axis, right? It's all about love given and love received. So with Leo, the desire is to have people love you. You want to be loved. You need to be loved. You need validation. These are the things that help you thrive and flourish and become a better version of yourself. They often accuse Leos of being egotistical, but that's not an accurate picture. Leos are here. They're natural performers, but ultimately they want and need praise and validation. And they need warmth and love and affection. And they need to know that they're wanted, right? And that they belong, because they're not completely sure of it themselves. Their life lesson is about feeling love when it's received. Unfortunately for Mr. Stayner, this is not what he was receiving early on. So he had a huge, big bucket with a hole in it where, good, positive, healthy feelings were concerned, because no matter what you put in, it was all going right back out that hole because it was so damaged, which is unfortunate. So with this, a lot of the bizarre or inappropriate or weird behavior he may have expressed in his normal, quote unquote, non-murder time, that would have confounded or confused other people, may literally have been his best attempts at trying to garner love and sympathy and warmth and validation and, praise, all the things that we need as humans to grow. And if you don't think you need it, you're probably a robot or something. Just saying. Okay, so there's that. Now the last thing I want to look at too is right here, right? So he's got this Venus Neptune trine, which I thought was interesting. And if you include Chiron, this now becomes a grand trine. So this would suggest that in his lifetime, it would have been very easy for him to get on with people. He should have been very personable. I don't imagine, I'll have to go back and read his biography, but I don't imagine he had difficulty getting people to feel comfortable with him and to like him. Um, if his life had gone in a different direction, he would have made a phenomenal, literally an amazing life-changing counselor. He could have done and given so much good to so many people. Um, Unfortunately, his life circumstances did not allow this, and nobody reached him in time to untangle that mess in his head, and this is kind of where we ended up. So that's unfortunate. So all of this is to say that when you look at a chart, even for the chart of a murderer, there's a whole person in there, and people like Cary Stayner don't happen out of nowhere. Like they're not born bad seed. They're literally brought into this world, and then people proceed to twist and hurt and harm and torture and poison them until they become so twisted up inside that you literally have a mangled psychological mess on your hands that does things like this. So it doesn't make him any less dangerous, and unfortunately, it doesn't undo what he's done. But I'm just saying that when it comes to stuff like this, the other thing that we should probably keep in mind is that at the end of the day, you and I, make our own monsters. These people don't exist um, on their own. They come into existence in response to the things that are literally forced on them early on when they had no power or ability to defend themselves, and there was no one there championing them or protecting them when someone should have been. So there you go. And that's what I have to say. So again, when you see charts and you see this nonsense about, oh, Mars, Pluto, Uranus, oh, violence, rape, power, abuse, blah, 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 just know. Like, this man murdered 4 people, savagely murdered them. 2 of them, I'm not completely sure what he did. I'm pretty, looking at the chart, my guess is he probably suffocated or strangled Carol. I don't have Sylvina's charts, I have no idea. With Julie, the daughter, I'm sure he tortured and raped her. And with Joy, the last one, I mean, records show that he nearly decapitated this woman, and God only knows what else he did. Like, that's some huge stuff right there. So, um, but if you look at that compared to what we're seeing in the chart right in front of you right now, we don't see any of these planetary lineups like they keep telling us, and these popcorn bubblegum machine astrology nonsense everybody's flying around the internet with and writing books on and all that sort of stuff. So the chart by itself and the planets themselves will not pinpoint these things. Everyone is capable of things. The difference is how much a person will endure before they get to the point that they break this badly, and in what way are they most likely to do something, right? So with him, with this Moon, Mars, Pluto lineup here, and the Moon moving somewhere between Mars and Pluto, like closer to one or the other, what we're likely to see is somebody who's going to be very methodical and very, very specific and very neat and tidy. Um, this is somebody who would necessarily, well, first, they don't like a lot of noise, so he would want you to be quiet. So that's the first thing. The first thing we do is silence them. Because remember, he's thin-skinned. He's neurotic. He's very easily upset are disturbed by things in the environment. So silence is golden for him. So the first thing he would have done is make sure they're quiet because he can't stand the noise. um, and then, of course, with all this, right, this Sun, Mercury, Uranus North Node in Leo, it would have been in his way. This would have been his final act of grandiose power. He would want them to see him, right? So we talked about how men want you to see them. If they're so angry that they're ready to take your life, they want you to know who they are. But in his particular case, this definitely would have been a bit of grandstanding, and this desire to make this a presentation, a grand presentation coming from him, which apparently, according to records, this may have been because there's some suggestion that in a lot of ways he was competing for, they think he may have been competing for notoriety with his brother who was abducted and returned years later. I know, twisted, right? But again, The family was grieving. The family was going through all sorts of changes. Like, what could they have done better, differently to protect their son? What did they do wrong? And he's grieving the loss of his brother and panicking because what if this happens to him? Because he's still a little kid too. And simultaneously, he's being molested by an uncle, and people probably aren't even paying attention or realizing that he's worse off than they think because they're so deep in their own crap, right? So there was a lot going on with this kid that really twisted him up into the really twisted adult he became. Oh, so, there you go, right? And then, of course, with this Venus-Neptune trine, I imagine he probably even tried to cover him up a little bit or do something nice. I mean, weird stuff, right? Like trying to be a little nurturing or kind towards the end. Anyway, so that is that, my friends. I gotta go take a shower, get all the serial killer stuff off of me. All right, so let's see here. For those of you who are aspiring astrologers or practicing astrologers or just dabble in it occasionally for fun and games, here's the most important thing I can give you in terms of making astrology useful and making your presence and your practice of this craft something that's helpful and worthwhile and good in this world. Okay? Understand that when you look at a chart, you are looking at an evolutionary code. It's a blueprint for a person's evolution. We don't know what process that a person needs to go through or what path they need to be on. We don't know these things, but we can get an idea of where the work needs to be done and how they're most likely to express some things, and where some things are going to be easier and when some things are going to be a little bit more challenging for them. Now, with that in mind, when you look at a chart, and these three victims are a classic example. They've got hard aspects all over the place. And I can't imagine that their lives were too horrible before they were murdered. I imagine they were having probably pretty nice lives. But there were evolutionary challenges that were presented to them as part of this life path and this process. Everything has to be taken in context. When we look at the chart of Cary Stayner, you're not seeing all the hard aspects that we saw in the victim's chart. We're not seeing any of those evolutionary challenges involving Pluto and Uranus and Mars and Neptune in the victim's chart. We don't see that in Cary's chart. In fact, Cary's chart looks pretty quiet, actually, pretty easy, mostly. So why and how did he end up becoming the person he is? And why does it matter? Well, the reason it matters is it's about the context of a person's life. It doesn't matter what the chart says. This chart has to be read in the framework and the context of the person's existence. If I have the chart for somebody who has all of the makings of being a fantastic business genius, right, and strong managerial skills, lots of entrepreneurial spirit, really good with people, blah, 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 what good does that do that person if they're born into, like, an impoverished hillbilly Kentucky Appalachian mountain where they can't get past the 6th grade because there's no ability or means for them to get further education? So they may be able to express all of those qualities, but it's going to be limited, defined, and colored by the environment and the circumstances that they find themselves in. And the same thing with easy charts. You can have somebody with all sorts of easy charts, easy aspect, great things going on in the chart. And like this boy who raped the girl behind the dumpster at a frat party, because the circumstances of their life were such that they were never responsible for anything. They were never held accountable or responsible for anything. They never had to deal with anything that forced them to develop their integrity or build character. This is who we ended up with. So the chart is only half of the information you're getting. The other half has a lot to do with the context of the person and the life that they're living. When you look at a person in the context of their life, it's extremely important that you be respectful of their life, their path, their process, their context. In the case of Cary Stayner, for all the awful, awful things that he did, in the context of his life as it had been lived up until that point, it makes all kinds of sense that he could have ended up like this. He could have also not ended up like this, but he did. And in the context of his childhood and all those experiences, it makes a lot more sense. When you look at a chart, especially if you're looking at a chart with hard aspects, never ever assume the worst, because you might have one of the finest individuals you have ever met sitting in front of you listening to you. Okay? Because people who've been through some stuff know things. And more importantly, they're the ones who have empathy. And they're the ones who know how to champion other people. And they're the ones who will always, before other people, step up to bat and put an end to a situation before it gets worse. Because they've been there, they've done that, they've seen a few things, they know how these things go. The people who are the most likely and quick to judge or take advantage of situations or advantage of other people and be insensitive and cruel, they're usually the ones who've had really good lives, very easy lives. They've never actually had to suffer anything, actually. So it's very hard for them to understand what it feels like for other people to be in these positions or to have that compassion muscle because they've never had to use it. So when you do astrology, understand this is only a drop in the bucket in terms of the information that's available to improve a life. Okay? Context is everything. And just like the victims in the chart, they can have all kinds of hard aspects and be amazing, wonderful people. You can have all these hard aspects in your chart and not end up a victim of murder, by the way. And you can have what looks like a really easy chart, almost too easy, and end up being a serial killer. It's all about context. All right. So we have another video coming up after this. We're actually going to look at the chart of some serial killers, looking for some similarities and differences and how these charts looked when we put them together. Interesting stuff. So if you're enjoying this video and you'd like more of that, a couple of things. First, hit the like button so I get some feedback about it. If you've got comments or questions, absolutely shoot them out there because we'd love to hear it. And certainly subscribe so you get notification of the next video. In all days and all ways, I hope you guys have an awesome day, week, month. Let's just get through this mess, right? One foot in front of the other. March on, march on. And again, let's hope that in the case of the Idaho 4 Bride and Koberger, that they do actually end up with the actually guilty party. Because it would be a travesty to ruin 5 lives instead of just 4. And I tell you what, I said it before and I'll say it again, if this turns out to be that he is not the person responsible for these murders, there is going to be holy hell to pay for a whole lot of people that had this boy judged, tried, and convicted before he ever went to trial. I'm just saying. All right, you guys. Talk to you later.